New Mexico Territory, 1883. The wind that day was older than any living memory. It came shrieking across the high desert with a voice woven from dust and fury from stories no one had ever bothered to write down. It screamed along the broken mesas, clawed through the brittle bones of sagebrush, and swept the canyons in a red storm that swallowed everything in its path. When it passed over the sun, it turned the sky the color of dying embers. Nothing moved. No hawks circled. No cattle braved the flats. Even the insects buried themselves under rocks to wait it out. The land felt hollowed as if something immense and hungry was moving unseen over the earth. At the crest of a shale ridge, Atsa knelt alone, motionless against the gale. A tall man, wrapped in a long, weathered coat, lined with the jaguar hide his uncle once wore. He looked carved from the same stone as the ground under his knees. In front of him, a small fire shivered and hissed in a ring of blackened rocks. Even in this storm, he had kept it alive. It was not his fire. It had belonged to his mother. She had knelt here in her time, a woman who could read the wind like scripture, who whispered in a language older than any priest's sermons. She had believed the fire was a bridge to something greater, something that listened and sometimes answered. Atsa did not come to speak prayers anymore, but he came to keep the memory of her hands tending this flame, and to remember he was not always alone. He sat there a long while, shoulders hunched against the gusts. He might have stayed until dark, but then a sound slipped through the storm. Faint, ragged, not the voice of wind or earth or ghost, but a human cry thin as a frayed thread. It rose and died again before he could be sure he had heard it. Atsa turned his head slowly, closed his eyes, listened. The wind gusted, tugging at his braids and lifting the edges of his coat. Again he heard it, a choked whimper swallowed by sand. He did not hesitate. He rose to his feet and moved down the ridge boots, sure on the unstable shale. His body knew this ground as well as he knew the lines of his own palms. He had walked it every season since he was a boy, mapping every hidden trail and blind gully. The sound came again closer now, a raw, wordless plea. The fence line emerged from the storm like a ruin dredged from memory. Once it had marked the trail to a mining camp, but the posts had rotted and snapped long before Atsa was born. Only one upright remained a lonely stake against the endless wind, and tied to it was a girl. She was slumped forward, her arms stretched high over her head, wrists bound in stiff leather straps. The wind tore at her hair, turning it into a black tangle across her face. Her dress, blue once, maybe, or white, was soaked in dirt and old blood. Beneath the hem, her ankles were scratched raw from kicking at the ground. Her hands hung limp, the fingers curled like claws. She looked impossibly young, no more than 18. For an instant, Atsa simply watched her chest, waiting, a breath, another, still alive. Then he moved. He drew his obsidian blade from its sheath and stepped to her side. With one hand, he touched her shoulder, a wordless warning, a reminder she was not alone. With the other, he pressed the blade to the strap. The leather parted cleanly under the edge. Her body collapsed forward like a puppet with no strings. He caught her before she struck the ground. She weighed less than a child. Her head fell against his collarbone, and when he drew in a breath, he could smell the fever rising off her skin. He did not ask her name. Names belonged to another hour. For now, there was only life clinging to a body that could not stand. He slipped off his coat, the jaguar fur, warm even in the storm, and wrapped it around her, arms and all. As he worked, her eyelids fluttered. A dry, cracked sound emerged, maybe a word, maybe only pain. He rested one broad palm over her heart for a moment, felt the thready beat, a promise that she was still here. Then he lifted her into his arms and turned his back to the howling wind. The path he chose was invisible to most, just a thread of rock winding down into the hidden gullies. But he knew every twist. His mother had taught him this trail when he was small enough to ride on her hip. Each time, the gale threatened to knock them off their feet. He adjusted his stance and pressed forward. Halfway to the canyon floor, she stirred again. Her cracked lips parted. A rasp. He bent his head, thinking she might try to speak, but only a faint sigh escaped her. Her face went slack again, cheek pressed to the warmth of his coat. By the time he reached the cave, the storm had begun to tire itself. Wind fell to gusts, then to shivers. The entrance was hidden behind a curtain of cedar branches, and when Atsa slipped inside, the hush felt absolute. He laid her gently on a pallet of pine needles and rabbit pelts. She did not wake. When he unwrapped the coat, he saw her wrists purple and swollen raw skin crusted with dirt. Carefully, he took a canteen and washed the wounds. The water ran pink into the bedding. He mixed a salve from dried roots, crushed it with the butt of his knife, and pressed it to the cuts with a tenderness no one watching him in the wind would have expected. He did not hurry. Each movement was deliberate, as though proving to himself that she was real, and not a ghost the storm had conjured. When the work was done, he sat back on his heels, breathing slow. Her hair lay across her cheek in damp clumps. For a moment, he remembered another face his mother's bent over this same bed. He had been younger than this girl was now too small to understand why his mother sang to the night instead of sleeping. He did not sing. He only watched the rise and fall of her chest. When she stirred, he thought perhaps she would wake. Her eyelids trembled. One hand twitched on the furs. But she did not open her eyes. She only turned her head slightly toward the fire, as if she sensed the warmth. Atsa stood and fed the coals until the flames climbed higher, painting the cave in light. He crouched beside her again, thought of speaking, of telling her she was safe. But the words felt hollow in his throat. Instead, he reached for a folded scrap of cloth. He dipped it in water, wrung it out, and laid it across her brow. A thin sound rose from her chest, a sigh or a sob, he couldn't tell. Her fingers curled slightly, as though to clutch something he could not see. Outside, the wind had quieted to nothing. The desert lay stunned in the hush that followed. Inside the cave, the fire crackled, the girl breathed, and Atsa watched. He did not know her story yet. But in that small, hard-won silence he knew this much: she was alive, and sometimes that was the only truth that mattered. The first thing she felt was warmth, not the kind that came from safety. She had almost forgotten what that felt like, but the undeniable heat of being alive in a place she did not know. It seeped into her bones, teased the edge of her memory. She tried to open her eyes, but the lids felt weighted with sand. Her lips were cracked, her throat raw. She could not tell if she had slept an hour or a year. Somewhere, close by, fire snapped and whispered. The soft scrape of movement came next. A shape shifted against the dim orange light. A hand touched her forehead, calloused but gentle. The contact rooted her to the present more firmly than any spoken word. Slowly, she made herself look. The man crouched on the other side of the fire, his face limned in shadows. His hair was bound back in a braid the color of polished wood. High cheekbones caught the glow. His eyes were black as a starless sky, patient, unreadable. She could not remember ever seeing a man look at her without wanting something. He poured water from a small kettle into a wooden bowl, steam curling up between them. Into the water, he scattered dried leaves and crushed stems. She watched, not daring to speak, afraid the sound of her voice might break whatever fragile truce this place had with her existence. He noticed her eyes were open. His gaze met hers without hurry or surprise. He set the bowl down and leaned back on his heels, hands resting palm up on his knees. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and even like the desert wind when it tired itself out. "Drink," he said. She licked her lips, tried to swallow, but her mouth felt too dry to shape words. He didn't move to bring the bowl closer, didn't cross the fire to touch her again. He only waited. After a long moment, she pushed herself onto her elbows. The motion sent a stab of pain through her side, fresh bruises screaming their memory. She sucked in a thin breath and reached for the bowl. Her fingers shook. He didn't offer to help. She realized in some distant corner of her mind that he was giving her the dignity of trying alone. When she managed to lift the bowl, the heat soaked into her palms chased some of the chill from her blood. She drank carefully, letting the bitter herbal taste slide across her tongue. The liquid soothed her raw throat, settled in her belly, with a heaviness that almost felt like comfort. When she had finished, she set the bowl back down. She watched her hand retreat across the furs, noting how thin her wrist had become, nothing but bone and fading bruises. The sight made her chest tighten. She drew in a breath and found her voice at last. "Why didn't you take anything?" The question cracked in the air between them. It was the only thing she could think to ask. She had woken too many times in unfamiliar places, stripped of her belongings, sometimes her dignity, and always her choices. The man didn't react with offense or confusion. He looked at her with the calm of someone who had heard many questions and learned most answers were the same. "Because nothing was mine to take," he said simply. The words hung there heavier than the darkness. She waited for more, an explanation, a demand, a transaction she knew how to survive. But he said nothing else. He picked up a long, smooth stick and began stirring the fire, coaxing the embers into new life. She found herself blinking back something hot at the corners of her eyes. "You could have left me," she whispered. "I could have," he agreed. "Why didn't you—" He looked up then. In the flicker of the flames, his gaze was steadier than anything she had ever known. "The wind carried your voice," he said. That was enough. She didn't understand, not really, but she stopped questioning. In that moment, she was too tired to keep her armor fastened tight. She pressed a hand to her ribs and drew a shaky breath. "I don't know your name." He didn't smile, but something eased in the lines of his face. "Atsa," he said. "It means eagle." She swallowed the syllables, catching on her raw throat. "Atsa," she repeated, tasting the unfamiliar shape of it. Silence settled again. It was not the cruel silence of locked rooms and shut doors. It was a quieter thing, patient like the hush before dawn. After a while, he reached for a strip of clean cloth, dipped it into a bowl of water, scented with crushed cedar. He held it up, waiting for her consent. She nodded once. He leaned across the fire, just enough to press it against her cheek. The coolness made her shiver. "Do you have a name?" he asked softly. She opened her mouth, closed it again. A dozen names flickered through her memory, some she'd been given by men who'd paid for her, some she'd chosen for herself when she tried to run. All of them felt hollow, like clothes that never fit. "I don't know anymore," she said at last. He didn't question that either. Didn't press. He only dipped the cloth again and cleaned the dried blood from the corner of her mouth. That was how she fell asleep, propped on one elbow watching him work, feeling the warmth of the fire and the steady rhythm of his breathing. When she woke next, she didn't know how much time had passed. The storm outside had faded into a hush so complete she could hear the wind moving like a thought through the canyons. The fire had burned lower, a bed of coals pulsing with gentle heat. She lifted her head and saw him seated cross-legged near the entrance of the cave, watching the dawn spread across the rocks outside. His silhouette looked almost carved into the world, unmoving, unbothered by the cold. "Did you stay awake all night?" she asked, voice husky. His head turned slightly. "The night doesn't care if I sleep," he said. For a long time, she just watched him. No one had ever spoken to her like that, like she was not a burden to be managed, like she was simply a person who existed. When she lay back down, she didn't try to fight the exhaustion anymore. She closed her eyes, and for the first time since she was a child, the dark behind her eyelids did not feel like something waiting to devour her. Outside, dawn came creeping in thin gold lines across the desert floor. Inside, Atsa sat with his hands folded in his lap, listening to her breath even out into the steady rhythm of sleep. He did not know who she had been before the wind carried her voice to him. But in that cave, in that hush, he knew who she was now. Alive, and that was enough. The third morning dawned in pale gray, the color of ash left too long in the hearth. Evelyn woke slowly, surfacing from a sleep so deep it had not allowed dreams. Her eyes opened to the low shelter, the familiar curve of stone and cedar, and the faint breath of the dying fire. She lay still, testing the stiffness in her joints. The bruises along her ribs ached, but not with the sharp bite of fresh hurt. More like the echo of an old injury that had begun to remember it was allowed to heal. She turned her head and found Atsa seated as he had been every morning, cross-legged near the entrance, watching the world with an expression she could not name. His presence had become something like the fire-quiet constant, offering warmth without ever asking if she deserved it. When she tried to sit up, her arm trembled. Atsa rose without a word and came to her side, sliding one hand behind her shoulders to steady her. The ease with which he moved startled her almost as much as the gentleness. Men she had known before moved with urgency, with ownership. His touch felt like something else, permission, not possession. "Better," he said softly. She nodded, then cleared her throat. Her voice rasped when she spoke. "I'm hungry." A small wry smile ghosted over his face, and he inclined his head as though she had offered some truth worth respecting. He gestured toward a clay bowl by the fire where something thick and brown steamed slowly. "Eat. You need your strength." He helped her lean back against a folded blanket. She took the bowl in both hands, surprised by the way it steadied her to hold something warm. She lifted the spoon and tasted the broth, earthy heavy with wild roots and dried meat. It filled her mouth with the memory of a place she had never been, a place where no one had known her name. When she had eaten enough to feel the heaviness settle in her belly, she set the bowl aside and looked up at him. He had returned to his place by the entrance, where he crouched with a small bundle of leather and bone laid out before him. "What are you making?" she asked. He did not look up from his work. His fingers moved in patient loops, threading sinew through drilled bone discs. "Tools," he said simply. She watched in silence. The small pieces took shape, slowly a clasp for a quiver, a fastening for a belt. She found her eyes tracing the lines of his hands, memorizing the way they moved. She had never noticed hands before. Not like this. Time drifted unmeasured by clocks or chimes. The cave brightened as the sun climbed. When she finally stirred, pressing her palms against the floor to shift her weight, Atsa raised his head. "You are stronger," he said. "I think so." He nodded once. "Then it is time." She frowned. Time for what? To stand. It was such a simple statement that it almost made her laugh. But when she saw that he was serious, her stomach fluttered with something she could not name. He crossed the space and offered her his hand palm open. She hesitated. The memory of bound wrists of men who gripped too tightly flickered through her. But when her gaze lifted to his, she found only patience there. No hurry, no hunger, just an invitation. Slowly, she placed her hand in his. He helped her rise, guiding her to her feet, as if she were made of something fragile and valuable. She swayed. His other hand came to rest lightly at her elbow. One breath, he murmured. She did as he asked, closing her eyes. The air tasted of cedar and old smoke. When she opened her eyes again, she felt almost steady. They stood like that for a while, her breathing shallow, his steady and unhurried, until her legs no longer threatened to give way. Then, with a nod, he released her and stepped back. She took one careful step, then another. By the time she reached the far wall, her heart thudded hard with exertion. But she was standing unaided in a place where she was not meant to die. Good Atsa said. His voice carried no praise, no triumph, only truth. She found that she preferred it that way. That afternoon, when the sun reached its zenith and spilled gold across the rocks outside, he showed her how to grind dried herbs. He knelt beside her at the low stone table, placing sprigs of something sharp-scented into her palm. Yarrow, he said, for wounds. She crushed the brittle stalks beneath the smooth river stone, feeling them break into dust beneath her hands. The work steadied her. It gave her a reason to keep breathing. They spoke little. The silence between them did not feel like emptiness. It felt like respect. When her hands grew tired, she sat back and watched him work. He used a narrow blade of obsidian to shave curls from a piece of cedar. He coaxed a tiny fire into being on a fresh stone hearth, not for heat, but to dry the powdered herbs. Every motion was deliberate clean. She had never seen anyone treat the simplest tasks with such reverence. After the fire had burned down, he gathered the dried herbs into a small leather pouch and pressed it into her hand. "For you," he said. She closed her fingers around it, surprised by the way her throat tightened. "Thank you." When dusk came, he built the evening fire higher. She sat wrapped in his uncle's jaguar-lined coat, feeling the tiredness seep back into her bones. Her gaze drifted to the small altar of stones near the back of the shelter. "What is that place?" she asked quietly. His hands stilled. "My mother's altar," he said after a moment. She prayed there. "To what?" "The wind," he said simply. Evelyn looked at the little arrangement of stone and ash. Did she believe it listened? Atsa turned the smallest smile toward her, the kind that did not touch his mouth, but softened the lines around his eyes. Sometimes he said it did. The fire popped softly between them. For the first time, she felt a question she was almost afraid to ask. "And you, do you believe it listens?" He met her gaze without flinching. "I believe the wind remembers," he said, "even when people forget." Her throat worked. She did not know how to hold so much gentleness without suspicion. Outside, the darkness pressed close to the cave, but inside the fire kept its little kingdom of light. When he rose and crossed to the altar, she did not look away. He knelt there, head bowed, and laid a sprig of cedar across the stones. He did not speak a prayer aloud. He did not ask her to join him. Still, she watched the way his shoulders eased, the way his breath slowed. And in some small, unfamiliar corner of herself, she wondered what it might feel like to have a faith that did not demand anything in return. After a time, he returned to his place by the fire. They did not speak again. The quiet settled around them like an old blanket, worn but comforting. When she finally lay down, she thought of the wind, of the fire that would not die, of a man who had given her a name without asking for hers. She slept without dreams. And when dawn came again, She found that for the first time in her life, she was almost ready to learn how to begin. The days settled into a rhythm she did not expect. When Evelyn had first woken in that cave, she thought she would only stay long enough to heal until her legs remembered their purpose, and her mind remembered that running was safer than staying. But the storm had passed days ago, and she found herself still here, watching the sun move across the walls in slow arcs of gold, learning to read the hours not by clocks, but by the color of light. She woke early now, sometimes before Atsa rose from his place near the entrance. She no longer needed help to stand, though the bruises on her ribs still ached if she moved too fast. Every morning she walked the length of the shelter and back, feeling her strength return in increments too small to measure. On the fourth morning, when she turned to sit by the fire, she found him watching her. "You will not stay here forever," he said quietly, as if reading the question she hadn't dared voice. She swallowed. "I don't know where else to go." Atsa inclined his head slightly. "Then stay until you do." He did not offer more. He did not promise she would be safe forever. She was grateful he didn't. Promises had always felt like traps. That morning, he showed her how to mend a tear in the thin deer-hide blanket. They sat side by side, her fingers clumsy on the coarse thread. She was accustomed to needlework, but only the kind that produced lace and ruffles decorations to be admired by men who measured a woman's worth by the delicacy of her stitches. Here, no one cared how neat the seam looked, only that it held. She asked him about it. Why not make something prettier? Atsa looked at her as though the question itself was foreign. "Because no one will see it but us," he said simply. For a moment, she didn't know how to answer. She had never known a world where survival mattered more than appearances. When the repair was done, she set the blanket aside and flexed her sore fingers. Atsa gathered the needle and sinew, returning them to a small bundle he kept wrapped in oiled cloth. Then he rose, reached for his long coat, and gestured for her to follow. "Today," he said, "you learn to listen." They left the shelter together, stepping into a morning so crisp it tasted of iron. Frost lingered in the shaded crevices of the rock. The sky above them stretched vast and blue, so wide it made her feel both small and somehow freed. Atsa led her along a narrow trail that wound up the canyon wall. He moved with the same quiet purpose he always did, never glancing back to see if she followed. She liked that about him. It was not indifference, it was trust. When they reached a shelf of rock that overlooked the valley, he stopped and crouched. He pressed his palm flat against the stone. "Sit," he said. She folded her legs beside him, shivering slightly as the cold seeped through her tunic. "Close your eyes." She did. "Now," he murmured, "tell me what you hear." At first, she only heard her own heartbeat, loud in her ears, too fast. She tried to slow it to focus on the world beyond her ribs. "Wind," she thought. "I hear the wind." Atsa didn't reply, which she knew by now meant keep going. She listened harder. The wind shifted across the rocks in small, restless gusts. Somewhere, far below, she heard the faint trickle of water, one of the narrow streams that threaded through the valley floor. "A stream," she said. And she frowned, straining to separate the layers of sound. Her pulse, her breath, the restless hiss of wind, and "There's birds." Atsa's voice was low, almost approving. "Ravens," he said. "Two." Her eyes flew open. "You can tell how many." He looked at her, his expression unchanged. "The land speaks," he said, "if you learn how to listen." Her gaze drifted over the valley. In the distance, a pair of black shapes lifted from a gnarled pine. She felt something tighten in her chest, something like longing. "I was never taught any of this," she whispered. "Most people are not," Atsa said. "They fill the silence with their own noise. They call it progress." She pressed her lips together. In her old life, she had been surrounded by noise laughter that wasn't kind music that felt like a cage men's voices ordering her to smile. Silence had always felt dangerous. Now she wondered if it could be something else. They sat there for what might have been an hour or a lifetime. Atsa did not speak again. She did not ask questions. When the wind rose, she closed her eyes and let it comb her hair across her cheek. When she finally looked at him, she said the smallest truth she had carried since the night he found her. "I don't know who I am without someone telling me." His gaze did not waver. "Then you will have to decide," he said. She did not answer. She didn't know how. They returned to the shelter in silence. She felt different, though she could not have explained why. As if something had shifted inside her, some bone she had never known was broken now beginning to set. When they reached the cave, she paused at the threshold. "I'm tired," she said softly. "Rest." But she did not lie down. Instead, she sank to her knees near the fire and closed her eyes. She tried to listen not only to the world, but to herself. For the first time, she did not flinch from what she found. That evening, she sat by the fire while Atsa carved narrow strips of hide. She watched his hands, memorizing the rhythm of the blade. Finally, she asked the question she had feared most. "Why did you help me?" His hands stilled. For a moment, she thought he would ignore her. But when he spoke, his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. "Because you were left to die," he said. Her throat tightened. "But you didn't know me. You still don't." His dark eyes met hers across the fire. "I don't have to," he said. The simplicity of it undid her more than any kindness. Later, as she lay wrapped in the jaguar-lined coat, she touched the leather cord around her neck. It was nothing, just a bit of old string. But it was also the first thing anyone had given her without expectation. She thought of the ravens on the pine, of the hush of the stream of the wind that carried no judgment. And for the first time, she wondered if she was allowed to belong to herself. She slept with her hand curled around the cord. Outside, the wind moved through the canyons in slow, deliberate breaths, as if it too had chosen to stay. The cold began as a whisper in her bones. Evelyn felt it first when she woke before dawn, the way she always did now, her body caught in the rhythm of a life lived close to the ground. She had been dreaming of water, clear running sweet on her tongue. When her eyes opened, the dryness in her mouth made her throat ache. At first, she thought it was only the dryness of winter air. She sat up, clutching the fur Atsa had given her, and the world tilted sideways, sliding out of focus. A wave of nausea rolled through her, and she had to press her hand to the packed earth to steady herself. The fire had burned low. She could see Atsa beyond it, crouched by the low wooden shelf where he kept his tools. He was carving something from bone, a small figure, the shape indistinct in the flickering light. His face was intent, his hands moving with the quiet certainty she had come to find so comforting. She tried to speak his name, but her voice cracked. He looked up at once. Even in the dimness, she saw how his gaze sharpened. He set aside the carving and came to her without hurry, but without delay. He knelt beside her and laid the back of his hand against her cheek. His skin felt cool, impossibly steady. "You have fever." She wanted to deny it, to say she was fine, that it was nothing. But when she opened her mouth, her breath came ragged and shallow. The ache inside her had deepened, blooming from her spine out into her limbs. She shivered, though sweat had already begun to gather in the hollow of her throat. "I don't." She tried again, but her voice vanished into a dry rasp. Atsa did not argue. He rose and moved to the fire, coaxing it higher with slow, practiced motions. She watched him through a haze of dizziness, the way he laid the kindling in a precise pattern, the way his hands never hesitated. It was a kind of grace she did not understand. A life lived without wasted motion, without panic. He filled a clay bowl with water, added a pinch of dried herbs from a leather pouch, and set it near the flames. She could smell them as they warmed, sharp, bitter, a scent that made her stomach twist. The world pulsed in and out of clarity. When she tried to lift her head, the shelter spun around her. She closed her eyes, swallowing against the rising sickness. "Atsa," she whispered. He was there again, kneeling at her side. He slid one arm beneath her shoulders and lifted her with effortless care, cradling her against his chest. Her cheek pressed to the beaded trim of his tunic, and she felt the slow, steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "Drink," he said, his voice low and even. She forced her eyes open. He held the bowl to her lips. The steam curled into her face, warming her skin. She wanted to turn away from the smell, but his hand was gentle and patient, holding her in place as she took one tentative sip. The taste was worse than she'd feared, bitter and earthy with an aftertaste like copper. She gagged, but he didn't let her pull away. "More," he murmured. She drank because she could not refuse him, because something in his voice made her believe she would be safe if she just did as he asked. When the bowl was empty, he set it aside and lowered her gently back to the furs. Her breath came in shallow pants. The ache in her joints had become a throbbing burn. She pressed her palm to her forehead, feeling the heat radiating off her skin. "How long?" she asked, her voice no louder than a breath. Atsa's brow furrowed. "How long have I been sick?" He shook his head. "Only tonight. You were well this morning." It didn't feel possible. It felt as if she had been burning for years. The fever came in waves. Time folded in on itself, hours stretching into endless darkness. She drifted in and out of awareness each moment, separated by long, blank spans when the world ceased to exist. Sometimes she woke to the sound of Atsa tending the fire, the crack and hiss of the wood a distant reassurance. Other times she opened her eyes and found him sitting beside her, sharpening his knife, or grinding herbs into powder, his presence as constant as the heartbeat in her ears. In her fever dreams she saw the fence again, the old trail, the broken post. She felt the leather biting into her wrists, tasted dust on her tongue. "No," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she spoke aloud. The shadows bent around her, turning into faces she didn't want to remember. Voices called her name, a name she no longer claimed. Yaka. The wind spoke it. Yaka. When she moaned, Atsa's hand found her shoulder, steadying her. "You are safe," he said, but she didn't feel safe. She felt hollow, unmade. The worst came on the second night. She woke with her heart hammering, her breath ragged. Sweat drenched her hair, plastered it to her skull. When she tried to sit up, a wave of vertigo slammed her back down. "Atsa." This time her voice cracked on the first syllable. He was there instantly. She felt his cool palm on her cheek, then his fingers on her wrist measuring her pulse. "Easy," he said. She tried to answer, but instead wrenched her stomach heaving. He caught her shoulders before she could fall sideways, turning her just enough so she wouldn't choke. When the fit passed, she lay trembling in his arms. He didn't speak, didn't offer false reassurance. He only held her as though her shaking body was not a burden. Her eyes fluttered open. The fire had burned low again, and in the red glow she saw how tired he looked. Fine lines etched the corners of his mouth. "Why do you stay?" she croaked. Atsa blinked as if the question surprised him. "You should sleep," he said. "I asked you." He looked away toward the dying flames. For a long time she thought he might not answer. Then, very softly, he said, "Because you have not left." Her throat tightened. She closed her eyes before the tears could spill. The fever finally broke just before dawn. She woke to find the air cool again, the terrible heat in her bones gone. Her skin was damp, but her breathing had steadied. Atsa was still beside her, though his eyes were closed. He sat cross-legged, his chin resting on his chest, one hand resting lightly on the furs. She studied him. Really studied him for the first time since she'd come to this place. The scars on his knuckles, the calluses on his palms, the way his mouth softened when he was asleep as though all the hardness he wore in waking life had slipped away. She lifted her hand. It trembled with weakness. Slowly, she let her fingers drift across his. His eyes opened. He didn't pull away. "Thank you," she whispered. He studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded once as if her words were neither expected nor required, but simply part of the truth between them. When she slept again, it was not the fever that claimed her. It was something gentler, a darkness without fear. And in her dreams she stood on the ridge, her hair lifted by the wind. "Yaka," the wind whispered, and this time she whispered back, "I am here." When the fever released her, Evelyn woke into a quiet so profound it almost felt wrong. She lay still, her eyes adjusting to the dim dawn. The fire had burned low, leaving only a scatter of coals that pulsed like embers in a long-forgotten hearth. Every part of her felt wrung out. Her limbs were heavy, her skin damp with the last residue of fever sweat, but she could breathe. That alone felt like a miracle. She turned her head and saw Atsa crouched by the doorway, mending a tear in his leather coat. He worked with a long needle and a length of sinew, each motion calm and unhurried. The morning light angled across his face, picking out the lines that fatigue had etched deeper. She wondered when he had last slept. For a long moment, she watched him without speaking. The past days were a haze of pain and disorientation, yet somehow his face had been the constant in all of it, anchoring her, even when she no longer remembered her own name. "Have you been here all night?" she asked, finally, her voice husky. He looked up, and for the first time she noticed how the dark circles beneath his eyes betrayed his exhaustion. He nodded once, as if it were not worth mentioning. "You should rest. So should you." Neither of them moved to stand. In the stillness, Evelyn became aware of how differently her body felt. Weakened, yes, like the fever had burned through not just her sickness, but all the brittle armor she'd once relied on. But there was also something else. A lightness she hadn't known in years, as though some old infection had been drawn out of her spirit as well as her blood. She shifted her weight and drew the hide blanket closer around her shoulders. The motion made her feel like herself again. Atsa finished stitching and set the coat aside. "You need food," he said. He retrieved a small pot, ladled out broth, and brought it to her, holding the bowl in both hands. She noticed how careful he was not to touch her unnecessarily. She wondered if he even knew he did that, or if it was a habit learned long before she ever arrived. When she tried to lift the bowl, her hands shook too much to hold it steady. She set her jaw, determined to do it anyway, but he simply knelt beside her gently, taking her hands in his and guiding the bowl to her lips. It was a simple kindness, yet it undid her in a way nothing else could have. The broth was hot tasting of roots and a faint trace of smoke. She swallowed it slowly, her throat grateful for the warmth. He did not speak while she drank. He only watched her with the same quiet gravity he brought to everything. "Thank you," she murmured when she finished. He inclined his head, then took the bowl and set it aside. She studied his profile in the flickering light. "Can I ask you something?" "You can." "Why did you take me in?" He looked at her fully, then dark eyes steady. "Because the wind brought you." "The wind?" He turned his palm upward as if to demonstrate. "Sometimes it carries things that are lost. You were lost. That's not a reason." He considered this for a moment, then said simply, "It was enough." She wanted to ask him more, to demand why he had risked himself for a stranger, why he had not simply left her at that fence to die. But she heard something final in his tone. For Atsa, that had been all the reason required. and in her heart she could not deny that she understood. The day passed in quiet recovery. Atsa busied himself with tasks around the shelter, checking traps, fetching water, splitting firewood. Each time he returned, she felt the cabin grow safer, as if his presence alone fortified the walls against the world outside. Evelyn forced herself to rise and sit by the fire. Her legs trembled, but she did it anyway. The act felt like reclaiming a piece of her will. When he noticed, he gave no praise, only a small nod that told her he understood the effort it had cost. By afternoon, she had managed to eat a small portion of dried meat and some more broth. Each bite felt like an argument against the emptiness she'd once carried. It was nearly sunset when he returned from outside carrying a bundle of small branches. He set them by the hearth, then crouched beside her. "Tomorrow," he said, "you will be stronger." "How do you know?" "Because you are still here." She looked down, her breath catching. "No one has ever believed I would last." He reached out very deliberately and touched her hand, just a single warm pressure of his palm against her knuckles. "Then they did not know how to see you." Night came with a wind that curled around the shelter like an animal seeking warmth. The fire was bright and steady. Atsa sat on the other side of it, carving a length of wood. Evelyn watched him, and slowly she let her gaze soften, allowed herself to really see him. Not just the stranger who had found her, or the protector who had stayed through the worst of her fever, but the man who had chosen again and again not to claim her as anything except what she was herself. It stirred something in her chest, something she hadn't felt since she was a girl too young to understand the difference between love and ownership. "Atsa," she said softly. He lifted his head. Her throat tightened. The words she wanted felt too fragile to survive the air. He waited, never pressing. "Never mind," she whispered finally. But he understood, she thought. He always seemed to. That night, she did not dream of ropes or locked doors. She dreamed of the ridge where he had first taught her the word Yaka, of wind that carried away her old name, leaving her lighter than she had ever dared to be. She woke just before dawn. He was asleep by the fire, sitting cross-legged, his head tipped forward, hands folded in his lap. Evelyn watched him in the dim glow of coals. The urge to move closer rose unbidden, startling in its intensity. Her whole life, closeness had been a threat, a transaction, a trap. But here in this small shelter, she had begun to suspect it could also be something else. Slowly, she rose, testing her balance. Each step felt like reclaiming herself from the ashes of fever. She crossed the space between them and knelt beside him. His breathing was slow and even. In sleep, his face was gentler, unguarded. She did not reach to touch him. She only sat, allowing her presence to be what it was, a choice. When he stirred and opened his eyes, she held her breath, afraid she had crossed some unseen line. But he only looked at her with that quiet, steady regard. "You should rest," he said. "I did," she whispered. A moment passed as soft as the hush between heartbeats. Then she said the thing that had waited on her tongue all night. "I don't want to run any more." His gaze did not waver. "You don't have to." The words were simple, but to her they felt as sacred as any vow. Outside, the wind rose, catching at the edge of the hide that covered the doorway. She thought for the first time that she might believe in something like hope, and when she lay down again, she did so on her own strength, her own will, her own name. Yaka, the girl who had survived. The woman who would claim her life as hers and no one else's. Morning came with the hush of early autumn. The first breath of cold in the air carried a promise soon the canyons would be dressed in frost. Evelyn Yaka rose with the dawn. Her steps were steadier now. Each morning she forced her legs to carry her farther, testing the edges of her strength. She would not be a girl rescued and hidden away. She would not be a burden. Atsa watched her from the fire pit, his eyes thoughtful but never pitying. By mid-morning, she ventured beyond the clearing alone. She moved slowly along the game trail, stopping to rest against a boulder when her breath grew ragged. She let the wind cool her cheeks. The ridge rose beyond where she had spoken her name aloud. She had thought that day marked an ending, but she was learning that even survival had its seasons. She was still there when Atsa came to find her. He did not call out, only appeared at her side with the quiet of a shadow. "Your legs will tire before the sun is high," he said, a soft caution. "I know," she replied, "but I need to see it." He followed her gaze to the ridge. Understanding flickered in his eyes. "You want to be sure you still have the courage," he said. She nodded. "You do." They climbed together. She set her jaw against the trembling in her muscles. He did not offer an arm, though she sensed he would have if she had asked. He honored her will to do it alone. At the crest, the wind met them, cool and searching. Yaka turned her face into it. The long grass bent around her ankles like a blessing. Here she felt the full shape of herself unclaimed. When she looked back, Atsa had stopped a few paces behind. He stood with his arms folded, eyes on her, a question unspoken. She answered by lifting her chin. "I won't be taken again," she said. "No," he agreed, "you won't." Later, as they descended the slope, Atsa paused to study the line of the valley. His gaze sharpened. "What is it?" she asked. "Dust," he murmured. "Riders." Her heartbeat skittered. She followed his line of sight. Far off, the land lifted in faint brown columns. He crouched in the grass, testing the breeze. When he spoke again, his voice was flatter. "Too many for hunters, too few for soldiers. Bounty men," she said, her throat dry. His jaw tightened. "Yes." They returned to the shelter in silence. Yaka's body felt both alive and brittle. Every step was an argument against the old fear. Inside, Atsa gathered supplies, dried meat, a skin of water, her spare tunic. He packed with the economy of someone who had known flight before. She watched him, a memory flickering behind her eyes, rope biting her wrists, a cart carrying her back toward a life she hadn't chosen. "I won't run," she whispered. His hands stilled. "They will come here," he said. "Then let 'em." He looked at her, and for the first time she saw the small fracture beneath his calm. "If they take you, I won't follow." She swallowed. "Because it would be your death." "Because it would be yours," he said. They did not speak again until sunset. She sat by the fire, hands folded in her lap, feeling the old tremors return. Not of weakness of memory. He knelt before her. In his palm lay the polished river stones he'd once given her. "When the wind comes," he said, "you must decide." Her eyes lifted to his. "Decide what? If you are Yaka, only when it is easy, or when it costs everything." That night the first hoofbeats came. They began as a murmur, like a dream stirring. Then they grew a rhythm of iron on earth, the steady promise of men who did not expect to be denied. Yaka rose, her legs trembling, but she stayed upright. Atsa placed a hand lightly on her shoulder. "Hide if you must," he said. "I won't," she replied. The riders emerged from the pines in a loose column, 7 men in all. 2 wore wide-brimmed hats pinned up on one side, a mark of bounty hunters. One rode ahead, his posture confident. A scar ran from his temple to the corner of his lip. He reined in at the edge of the clearing, his gaze moving over the shelter of the fire, and finally to where Yaka stood beside Atsa. "Well," he called, his voice carrying in the hush. "She matches the description." Yaka didn't flinch. Atsa stepped forward just enough that she could feel the heat of him at her back. "You have no claim here," he said. The scarred man smiled thinly. "I have a writ from the territorial court," he replied. "Girl named Evelyn Dorsey, property of Mr. Harrison's establishment. Fled her contract." You know what that is. A lie, she said, her voice steady. His eyes flicked to her, assessing. Girl, you come with us quiet, you'll be treated decent. Fight, and you'll hang for theft of service. Yaka took a slow breath. I am no one's property. Law says different. Law Atsa said has no power here. The standoff lengthened. Behind the hunters, the pines moved in the wind. Won't ask again, the leader called. Yaka's heart slammed against her ribs. She thought of the first night Atsa had found her, how she'd been so close to dying that any future seemed impossible. She thought of the name he had given her. She stepped forward. I will not go, she said. The scarred man's smile vanished. So be it. His hand dropped to the butt of his revolver. Atsa moved faster. In a single breath, he stepped in front of her, drawing the obsidian knife he kept hidden at his waist. The blade glimmered dark as night. Yaka felt the world contract to the sound of her pulse. One of the hunters lifted his rifle. She didn't think. She moved. Her hand shot out, gripping Atsa's arm. She pulled herself to stand beside him, shoulder to shoulder. I will not be hidden, she said. His jaw flexed. I know. The leader's voice grew hard. You think you're protecting her, but you're condemning her. No, Atsa said softly. I am standing with her. It happened in a heartbeat. The rifle came up. Yaka's breath left her in a rush, and then a single shot cracked the air. But it didn't come from the bounty hunters. A rider broke from the trees behind the line of mounted men. A young deputy in a dust-stained coat, his pistol still smoking. Hold, he shouted. By order of the territorial marshal. The hunters wheeled their horses, confusion breaking their formation. The deputy, she recognized him, now the same young man who had helped free other girls from Harrison's brothel, galloped forward holding up a folded paper. New orders, he called. All claims against Evelyn Dorsey are suspended pending investigation. The scarred man spat. Territorial court signed the writ, and the marshal countermanded it, the deputy said. You have no authority here. The silence that followed was the loudest sound Yaka had ever heard. She looked up at Atsa, and for the first time she allowed herself to lean against him. His hand settled at her back, light but anchoring. In the end, the bounty hunters turned their horses and rode away. They left without another word. Only the deputy remained, his chest rising and falling with the adrenaline of what he'd done. He dismounted and approached. Miss, he said, his voice rough. It's over, for now. Yaka swallowed hard. Thank you, she whispered. He nodded, his expression unsteady. Marshal says you're free to go where you will, he said. But he asked me to give you this. He held out a folded letter. She took it with trembling fingers. Inside, in careful script, were the words, Your life is your own. No man may claim it. You have my protection as long as I wear this badge. Tears blurred her sight. When the deputy rode away, the clearing felt newly silent. Yaka turned to Atsa. I thought I was ready to die, she whispered. But you lived, he said. Yes, she breathed. I lived. His hand rose to touch her cheek. And tomorrow you will live again. She closed her eyes, feeling the wind brush her hair across his wrist. In that moment she knew. Survival was not the end of her story. It was the beginning. The morning after the bounty hunters rode away dawned unnaturally still. No wind moved the pines. No birds called in the gray light. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath. Yaka woke to that hush. For a moment, she did not remember where she was. Then she felt the warmth of the deer-hide blanket around her shoulders and the ache in her legs from standing her ground, and she remembered everything. She sat up slowly. Across the embers, Atsa was awake watching the coals with the patient calm he carried like another garment. For a long moment, neither spoke. When she finally did, her voice was quiet but sure. I want to go to the ridge. His gaze lifted to hers. Today, yes. He studied her face, searching for the tremor of fear. He found none. Then we will go, he said. They did not pack anything but water and a small pouch of herbs. She did not wear the tunic she had arrived in. Instead, she chose the simple garment she had sewn herself in the weeks she'd been free, undyed deerskin loose at the shoulders, belted at the waist, with a strip of blue cloth Atsa had traded for in the spring. Around her neck hung the leather cord he'd given her. When she stepped out into the clearing, Atsa was waiting. For the first time, she realized he had braided his hair differently. 2 plaits instead of one the way she'd once seen him wear it when he stood before the old altar. She lifted a hand to her own braid, feeling its weight, feeling the memory it carried. "Are you ready?" he asked. She nodded. They climbed in silence. The path was steep, and her muscles still remembered the terror that had once kept her body from growing strong. But each step felt lighter than the last. At the crest, the view opened around them a sweep of gold grass and distant mesas, the sky pale as new-washed linen. She turned slowly, taking in every angle of it. This land, this place where she had nearly died and had learned to live. Atsa did not speak, only watched her. After a time, she drew a steadying breath. "Will you show me?" He inclined his head. They knelt together on the flat stone shelf where the wind had always been strongest. Atsa untied the pouch at his belt and poured out a small mound of fine gray ash into his palm. "This is cedar burned in the old fires," he said, "carried by my mother before me." She reached out, touched the ash. It was soft as silk. "What do I do?" He looked at her with the depth of a man who had never lied to her. "You choose," he said. She swallowed. "Choose what?" "How you will be remembered," he said. "How you will remember yourself." Her heart thumped sudden and wild. "I don't know if I am ready." He tilted his head. "Then you are," he said, "because the ones who are ready too soon do not understand what it costs." Her eyes stung. She took the ash from his hand with trembling fingers. It left gray smudges along her palms. The wind stirred then, soft questioning. She closed her eyes and listened. When she opened them again, she saw Atsa had laid a flat stone between them. "This is yours," he said simply. She nodded. Then she dipped her finger in the ash and began to draw. First, she traced a spiral, a mark she had learned from him, the sign of a journey that circles back on itself. Next, she made 4 lines pointing outward, each for a season she had survived the winter of her capture, the spring of her escape, the summer of her hiding, and the autumn of her naming. Then in the center she paused. Her hand hovered. "I don't know how to write what I am," she whispered. Atsa's voice was so soft she almost thought she imagined it. "You already have." The wind rose, then lifting strands of her hair across her cheek. And she understood. She pressed her palm flat into the ash, smearing the marks into a single shape, imperfect, untranslatable, hers alone. When she lifted her hand, the print remained. She sat back on her heels. It doesn't look like anything she said. It looks like everything he answered. They stayed like that for a long time. When the sun had climbed halfway to its height, she finally spoke. "Will you give me your blessing?" Atsa's gaze rested on her with a gentleness she had only begun to trust. "No," he said. Her breath caught. "I am not your father," he continued. "I am not your elder. It is not my place to give you permission to be who you already are." Her throat tightened. "Then what will you give me?" she asked. He reached out, laid his hand over hers, covering the print she had left in the ash. "My witness," he said. Her tears came then, not of sorrow, but of something deeper, a recognition. She was no longer Evelyn who had fled, Evelyn who had hidden. She was Yaka who had chosen to stay. When the wind rose again, she lifted her face to it. "I was not born in this place," she said aloud, "but I belong to it." The wind answered, rushing around her in a wild spiral and dance. And in that sound she heard the voice she had been straining to remember her whole life. Her own, They descended the ridge as the afternoon light slanted long over the valley. At the base, Atsa stopped. "There is something more," he said. She turned to him, wary but unafraid. He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded piece of cloth. When he unwrapped it, she saw what it was. A small strip of blue calico frayed along the edges, her old neck ribbon. She stared at it, feeling her heart squeeze. "I thought it was lost," she said softly. "It was," he answered. "But I found it the day you stood your ground. I kept it." "Why?" "So you would remember," he said, "that you can leave behind what hurt you, but you don't have to pretend it never was." She took the ribbon in both hands, and for the first time she did not feel its weight as a chain. They returned to the shelter as the last light touched the treetops. Yaka sat by the fire, twisting the ribbon between her fingers, then tying it into her braid. Atsa watched her. When she finished, she lifted her gaze. "You never asked me what happened before," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I want to tell you," she continued. "Not because I owe it, but because it is mine." He inclined his head. "I will listen." And so, as the darkness gathered, she spoke. She told him of the red-curtained house of the men who called her pretty as they pressed her down, of the night she tried to forget the name she had been given. She did not weep, and he did not interrupt. When she was done, her voice was hoarse, but her shoulders no longer bowed. She looked into the fire and whispered, "I am not that girl anymore." "No," he said, "you are not." When dawn came, the wind shifted again, not as a warning, as an invitation. Yaka stepped outside and felt the land under her feet. She turned toward Atsa and smiled. "Will you walk with me?" He nodded. They did not speak again as they set out down the trail together. There was no need. In every step she knew. She was alive. She was free. She was Yaka, and no one could take that from her again.